and welcome to Mississippi Insight. I'm Byron Brown. Thank you for joining us. This week, an investigation uncovers a troubling trend in how Mississippi deals with people in need of mental health treatment. Hundreds of them are put behind bars, often for weeks, even months at a time. Journalist Isabelle Taft joins us to discuss the investigation. And Magnolia Tribune's Russ Latino joins us with his thoughts on the state primary elections and the outlook for general elections in the fall. It's another packed show this Sunday on Mississippi Insight. Mississippi has one of the highest rates of incarceration in the nation, but today we focus on people held behind bars without ever being charged with a crime. The process is called civil commitment, and it's the subject of a deep investigation by ProPublica and MississippiToday.org. Well, one of the reporters on the story joins me now. It's Isabelle Taft. She covers health as part of the Mississippi Today's community health team. And Isabelle, thank you for joining us here for Mississippi Insight.
Thank you for having me, Byron.
You and your colleagues examined all dockets in several counties for this investigation. And what did you find that it covers there?
Yeah, what we found in the 19 counties for which we were able to get the dockets, and they clearly marked people in this situation, people were booked into those jails without criminal charges at least 2,000 times from 2019 through 2022. They were awaiting mental health evaluations and eventually treatment in most cases, and the entire time they were in jail, no allegation of a crime, but in many cases they were treated basically the same as people who are charged with crimes.
What is civil commitment in Mississippi, and why does it lead people to be in jail here?
Yeah, civil commitment is a legal process that exists in every state. It's a way for the state to ensure that if someone is suffering from serious mental illness and in some cases addiction, and they're not able to recognize that they need help, they're not able to consent to treatment, that there's still a way to get them into treatment. So even in states where jail is not part of this process, it's pretty controversial because it involves someone's civil liberties being taken away. They're not consenting to this treatment, they're being treated against their will. But here in Mississippi, the reason jail becomes part of the process is a little complicated, and it depends somewhat on the county that you're talking about. But in most cases, it happens A, because the law here permits it. We have a law that says jail can be used for this purpose if there is no reasonable alternative. And B, because there's just a lack of treatment facilities that will accept people going through this process. We have expanded in recent years the crisis stabilization units, but people at the county level told me most of the times those facilities are full, or they can be very selective. So if they decide someone is too violent or they can't handle their medical needs, they will not accept that person, and in many cases that person instead goes to the county jail.
Would substance abuse cases be eligible for civil commitment?
Yes, in Mississippi, substance abuse is there's a separate legal pathway for civil commitment for people suffering from drug and alcohol addiction. Technically, since 2021, it has not been, the Attorney General's office issued an opinion saying those folks cannot be held in jail, but we found some instances where that was still happening, and prior to that opinion, it happened quite frequently as well.
And how many people are you finding that are being committed to civil commitment, and over what time frame is that happening?
Yeah, so if you look at the state as a whole, this happens to about 5,000 people per year just for the mental illness side. I'm not sure of the statistics for the drug and alcohol side. There's less kind of attention to that in general around the state. And so it's a fraction, it's not everyone who gets civilly committed is being put in a county jail, but it's a good chunk of everyone who goes through this process in our state will see time in a county jail.
Many of these jails and these departments are not equipped to handle mental illness, right?
Correct, yeah, and sheriffs have been talking about this for decades, actually, going back to the 80s, the 90s. They've been saying, look, this is not our job. We didn't sign up to treat people with mental illness. We have no ability to provide them treatment. We, in many cases, can't even provide them with medication. And yet there's been really very little change when it comes to the bottom line, the way this practice looks in our state for over 40 years.
And so basically these sheriff's departments are doing what? They're just kind of locking them up and just letting them sit there, or what's happening when they're in there? Yeah,
it depends somewhat on the jail. In some jails, they make an effort to isolate people going through this process, so they'll put them in a cell by themselves. In some cases, they may be able to get prescriptions from the local community health center or have some kind of access at least to medication. But in other cases, they don't even get that. A lot of times the jails don't know what medications people are supposed to be taking, and they won't prescribe them. I heard from some people who said that they did have prescriptions when they came into the jail, but were not able to access them while they were in the jail. Very rare for people to get therapy of any kind while they're in there. And in some jails, people are held in general population, which can create all kinds of problems, I heard about people getting into physical altercations with people who had been charged with crimes. So I don't think anybody in the state would say that jail is a good place or a safe place for people in this situation.
And on average, how long are people kept in jail under this civil commitment?
So I don't know, average statewide, but some of the stays that we looked at, the majority of them were longer than 3 days, a pretty significant majority, and over 100 of them were longer than like 30 days. So you're looking at, in some cases, at very, very long stays of weeks at a time, but generally the stays would be in that 3 to 10 day period.
And when they come out, are they worse off than when they went in, or what are we finding when you talk to someone?
What I've heard from people who went through this process, they say, by the time I got to the state hospital for psychiatric treatment, I felt like they were having to straighten me out all the way over again. I talked to a program director at the South Mississippi State Hospital who said he sees in his patients a real issue with trust. Once you've been, in a mental crisis and then taken to jail and you haven't been charged with any crime, you don't belong there, you're a lot less likely to trust the system entirely. I've also heard from people who went through this process that they even consider themselves to be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And these are people often who were in crisis when they were taken to the jail, and so they're suffering from delusions and paranoia and all kinds of confusion and just true suffering while they're in the jail. And it doesn't make sense to them, and it really doesn't make sense to anyone involved in this process.
Yeah, what about people who have died behind bars because they've been taken to jail? What did you find there?
Yeah, we found since 1987, at least 16 Mississippians have died while they were in jail for this reason. The significant majority of them had been charged with no crime at all. A handful had been charged with things like domestic violence or disturbing the peace. And in most cases, they died by suicide, and they died because the jail either did not identify them as at risk of hurting themselves, even though that's the reason they were in there. Civil commitment requires someone to testify you're at risk of hurting yourself or another person. Or in other cases, the jail did know that they were at risk, but didn't take adequate steps to protect them.
You've also brought your findings to mental health authorities, advocates, and other experts about the legal implications. What have you found there, and what are they telling you?
Yeah, people around the country who looked at some of our findings said, A, this doesn't happen to the same degree anywhere else in the country that we're aware of, and B, a lot of them said they don't see how this can be constitutional. Jails exist to hold people to decide if they need to be punished, and in some cases to punish them. They don't exist just to serve as holding facilities for people who need medical treatment.
So if families call for help and the first response is from police, what do families do, and what should the authorities do?
It would depend somewhat on the situation. With civil commitment, that happens initially with the Chancery Clerk's office, not always with a 911 call. But I think families should try to make sure they understand in their county, how does this process work? What is the risk or the likelihood in this county that you do get taken to jail? Not every county does this. Madison County, for example, holds few to no people in jail during this process. And authorities, I think, should be considering much more rigorously than they currently are, what are the alternatives available to them, and do they need to be putting people in jail just because someone has said they may need mental health or addiction treatment?
What's the message that you want the public to get from what your investigation and what you're writing?
Yeah, I think I would like the public to see that this is happening every day in our state, that it's happening to hundreds of people every year, that the conditions that people are facing in jail are really wrong and not suitable for the health conditions that they have. And I'd also like people to know that other states don't do this, and Mississippi doesn't have to do this.
Isabelle Taft, thank you for joining us. After the break, an election year conversation with Russ Latino. It's Mississippi Insight only on WJTV. The stage is set for key state office elections in November. The marquee race is for governor, and that campaign is already looking like a very expensive affair. Joining us via Zoom is Russ Latino. He's founder and CEO of the nonprofit news site, MagnoliaTribune.com. And Russ, welcome back to Mississippi Insight.
Thanks for having me, Byron.
Hey, let's talk first about the August 8th primaries. Lieutenant Governor Delbert Hosemann won about 52% of the vote and avoided a runoff with State Senator Chris McDaniel. Any surprise there?
Not really. I think we had been predicting an 8 to 10 point race, and so it basically ended up in that range. It ended up at a 9-point race. I think, you look at that race, and Lieutenant Governor Hosemann came in with the power of incumbency, which is a big advantage, came in with a big advantage from a fundraising perspective. Outraised his competitors, I think 10-1, outspent his competitors 10-1. And you still ended up with a relatively close race, avoided a runoff, but the closest race, candidly, since Eddie Briggs, who was the incumbent lieutenant governor in 1995, lost to Ronnie Musgrove. And so it was a fight. It was hotly contested. But at the end of the day, we thought the power of incumbency, the financial power, was going to win that race. And it looks like, that carried him over the finish line.
Yeah, some other news organizations have characterized McDaniel's loss as a death blow to the far-right conservative movement in Mississippi. Are they right, or is that just a bit far-fetched in your view?
Yeah, I think that's kind of an absurd take. I mean, it's the kind of thing that gets clicks, on headlines. The reality is that Senator McDaniel came in with his own baggage, having run several large, statewide, controversial campaigns. He also came in with his own base, right? So every race that he's run statewide now, he's gotten between 155,000 and 160,000 voters. It just turns out that's not enough to win a statewide election in Mississippi anymore, and not enough to win a Republican primary, given the influx of people into the Republican primary. But it's kind of silly to say that that's a death blow to conservatism. First of all, Lieutenant Governor Hosemann made very clear that he adheres to conservative values throughout the campaign. And so I sort of reject this notion that this was a vote for a more moderate point of view. I think by and large, the polls that we see show that Mississippians still consider themselves conservatives. And maybe that was part of what made it a close race, at the end of the race.
McDaniel funded his campaign with so-called dark money coming in from out-of-state supporters. Complaints about that funding has led to a fresh debate over Mississippi's lax campaign finance laws. Even Secretary of State Michael Watson offered some criticism of his fellow Republican Attorney General Lynn Fitch for not doing more to enforce those laws. What do you make of all of this?
Yeah, I think it's not to be surprising or not surprising when you consider sort of how hot that race got, and then the questions about, well, how is the challenger able to put these messages out? And I wouldn't be surprised if the legislature looks at it. Certainly, Lieutenant Governor Hosemann has signaled that he wants to continue looking at that issue. I think from my vantage point, the only caution is let's make sure that we don't prevent people from engaging in the political process, right? So if we're going to do campaign finance reform, let's do it in a smart way that doesn't discourage people from being part of the process, because otherwise what you end up getting is sort of the same group of people that fund every single campaign. And it almost becomes a situation where if you've got the seal of approval from certain trade associations, you're sort of decided as being the candidate. I think what we want to do is encourage real contest. And part of the way that you do that is ensuring that people can give.
Of course, the governor's race will likely see some of the highest campaign spending of the year. Both Tate Reeves and Brandon Presley are flooding the airways with campaign advertising. What are your thoughts on this race as we head into the fall?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, this is the only race really that's left on the ballot that's worth watching. There certainly are other races down ticket where you've got both a Republican and Democrat, but those races are not going to be competitive. And I think anybody who's being honest would tell you that. So the only real race to watch is this governor's race. The difficulty for Presley coming into this race is that his name ID was relatively low. He'd only run in the northern part of the state. You've got a governor in Tate Reeves who's been elected 5 times statewide, so his name ID is very high. Another difficulty is the fundraising disparity, Byron. So, if you looked at Tate Reeves' war chest, it's well over $10 million between the 2 campaign finance accounts that he's got. Presley has done better than Jim Hood did in fundraising, but is still dramatically behind when it comes to cash on hand. So he's got to raise enough dollars to be able to introduce himself to the public. And that's going to be really hard to do in the window of time that we've got. So I think those are the challenges that are in front of him, but it's certainly going to be a race to watch. It's a little bit like trying to predict, Alabama versus Ole Miss. You think Alabama's probably going to win the game, but you still want to watch the game.
I got you. Governor Reeves drew about 75% of the vote in the August 8th primary against 2 nominal Republican candidates. What does it say about the governor's November prospects when 1 in 4 primary voters choose someone else?
I don't think that's completely abnormal. Within political parties, oftentimes what you see is a desire of different factions maybe to signal protest votes. Maybe they didn't like a particular bill that a governor signed, or maybe they wish that he had signed another bill. So in the context of a primary, that's not abnormal. He still pulled close to 80% of the total Republican primary vote. I wouldn't read too much into that. I think the question as we get into the race is going to be whether or not Presley can build that name ID, whether or not he has sufficient resources to do it. And candidly, the challenge from Reeves against Presley is going to be, is he part of the national Democrat apparatus, right? Mississippi is a conservative state. And so, Presley has to walk this tightrope right now between appealing to national Democrat donors to get them to give money to his race so he's got enough money to run the race, and simultaneously wanting to pull over some moderate Republicans or even conservative Republicans into his camp to be able to beat Reeves. And that is a really tough balancing act that he's going to have to maneuver for the rest of the campaign as we head into this final stretch.
And speaking of Commissioner Presley trying to overcome that challenge and particularly that name recognition in parts of the state where he's not familiar, is he making the right move so far?
Yeah, it's hard to assess in terms of whether or not he's doing the things that he needs to do from a blocking and tackling standpoint. The polls that I've seen on this still have Governor Reeves up, in some cases up considerably. You throw on the money advantage, and that certainly would portend to another Reeves victory. But I'd also say, Presley has got some natural political chops. He's got a sort of Southern colloquialism demeanor, and all shucks, how's your mama and them kind of demeanor that I think does go over well. And so, I think the challenge for him is, can I introduce myself to enough people? And then simultaneously, how do I prove to a segment of voters that normally vote Republican and conservative to come over and not lose the base of Democrat support that I need both financially and on election day?
As far as legislative elections go, do you see any realistic prospects for Democrats to cut into Republican supermajorities this November?
Not really. And candidly, that's because they didn't qualify enough candidates. So if you looked at the qualifying paperwork on the day it was filed, what you would have seen was that even if Democrats had won literally every seat they qualified a candidate for, Republicans would have still had supermajorities. And so that makes it really difficult to cut into it if you're not putting up enough candidates that actually could cut into it.
Let me just get your thoughts on this. I know this isn't a statewide race, but in Hinds County, in the supervisors race, 2 supervisors got ousted in the primaries, 2 others are facing runoffs. What do you make of the shakeup that voters had with Hinds County supervisors?
I don't know that I've got a real firm read on that one. I think what you saw in Hinds County was a dramatic drop in the number of people voting. So where statewide they're actually basically held served during the primaries in terms of total votes, there were counties like Hinds County that had dramatic drops. My recollection serves, at least in the Republican primary in Hinds County, it was a 40% drop in participation. So what it signals to me is either that people aren't paying attention or that they're paying attention and don't feel like there are any good options, that there's a certain degree of frustration with the leadership of the county right now, and people are kind of washing their hands of the process.
Russ Latino, always good talking to you. Thank you for joining us.
Good being with you. Thank you.
Coming up, we'll talk with the first black Republican to win a state house seat since Reconstruction. We'll be right back. The primaries were an exciting time for many candidates, but one made history with his victory. 12 News senior political correspondent Richard Lake has more on the over 150-year stretch broken in the state legislature.
Rodney Hall defeated Charlie Hoots in the Republican primary for Mississippi House District 20 by 10 points in last week's primary elections. With no Democratic challengers in the general election, Hall is the first black Republican elected to the Mississippi House of Representatives since Reconstruction.
The beautiful thing of the matter, or the fact, is that while I was out on the campaign trail knocking on doors in the heat, in the rain, talking to neighbors, man, that never came up. I do think that that's a peripheral benefit, right? When you talk about our values, when you talk about our principles as a party, when you talk about the issues that matter most to people, I think that resonates despite the color that they are.
Hall is a nearly 20-year National Guard veteran and a former staffer of U.S. Representative Trent Kelly. Hall says he's focused on the future of Mississippi.
What does Mississippi look like, the next 5 years, 10 years, the next 20 years down the line? We still have some real challenges, even though we've made some progress. You look at poverty. There's a lot of people that are still poor, that are having a hard time to get ends meet. Our education system, while it's improved, there's still a lot of work to be done there. We're still at the bottom when it comes to our just overall health and well-being down here. And so those are some of the big issues that I'm looking to tackle.
Also in the legislature, incumbent Judiciary B Chairman Representative Nick Bain will likely head to a runoff against Brad Maddox. And presumptive House Speaker Representative Jason White won his primary race, collecting 80% of the vote. Representative White is the current Speaker pro tempore, who is viewed as the expected successor to House Speaker Philip Gunn, who is not seeking re-election. Reporting in Jackson, Richard Lake, 12 News.
Big thanks to Isabelle Taft and Russ Latino for joining us this week. We'll be back next weekend with more of the political and current affairs coverage that you demand. I'm Byron Brown from all of us here at 12 News. Make it a great weekend.